All right, let's start our lesson on domain and range of a function. Domain by definition is all possible x values, and range is also all the possible y values of a function. All right, so what do I mean by possible? Well, in math, there's really only two rules that you cannot break. All right, the first rule is you cannot divide by 0. No dividing by 0. Okay? You can't have that in the denominator. You can't do it. It makes no sense. The whole world blows up when that happens. The second one is that you cannot take the square root. You can't do the square root of a negative. Now, we realized that, with imaginary numbers, in the last unit we figured out we could do that, but it's not a real number. It's an imaginary number. So there's no real way to do that. So we have to make sure that in the domain we're not violating either of those two rules. So what we do is this. To find out the domain, we have to look to make sure that we don't violate those rules. In this case, we have this function, and in the denominator we have x squared minus 9, okay? Now, in the denominator, the one thing that I can't have is 0, right? This right here cannot be equal to 0. It could be a negative, it could be a positive, it could be a fraction, it could be crazy, all kinds of crazy numbers, but it cannot be 0, because then I'd be dividing by 0. So I set the denominator to not being equal to 0. So I solve this. Well, this is difference of squares. So this is x plus 3 and x minus 3 cannot be equal to 0. And that tells me what? That x cannot be equal to 3 and x cannot be equal to negative 3. So all other numbers, all real numbers are in the domain except for 3 and negative 3, because if I plug those in here, I'd be dividing by 0. Right? Imagine plugging in 9. 3. 3 squared is 9, minus 9 is 0. Everything's screwed up. The second situation you could have is this, where you have a square root. All right? Now, I won't be dividing by 0 here, but if I look at this, there's a possibility that I will take the square root of a negative, and that won't be in the domain. So this underneath the radical, everything underneath the radical I take, and I say that it has to be greater than or equal to 0. Because anything less than 0 will be negative. It could be equal to 0. It could be greater than 0, but it can't be less than 0. So I solve from here, and I just know that the domain has to be greater than 2. So all numbers that are greater than or equal to 2 are within this domain. And that makes sense, because if I plug 2 into this, it works. If I plug 10 into this, it works. But let's say I plugged in a number less than 2. Let's say negative 3. Negative 3 minus 2. Well, that's the square root of negative 5. Makes sense, and that negative 3 isn't in the domain. So remember, just take whatever is underneath the radical and say that has to be greater than or equal to 0, and so the answer is 2. This is the third situation you could have, where you have two things going on here. You can't be dividing by 0, and you can't have a negative number here, right? So what I'm going to do is take this x plus 1. I'm going to say it can't be negative, so we know it's going to be greater than 0. But it also can't be equal to 0, like in this example, because if this is equal to 0, then I'm dividing by 0. So if it's in the denominator here like this, I have to say x plus 1 must be greater than, not equal to 0. And I solve here, x is greater than negative 1. And that's all you had to do. All right, guys. Good luck.